His father's hand smelled of resin and wet wool. They were pressing spruce branches into the sheep pen on a December afternoon in Norway, the blue light turning the snow violet at the edges, the yews shifting against the north wall. The branches were loose, full of gaps, and the boy said they were not thick enough to stop the wind. His father pressed his palm flat against the brush and said, "I'm not stopping the wind. I'm giving the snow a quiet place to choose." 20 years later, kneeling in frozen Kansas dirt with two children inside a cabin the wind walked through like it owned the place, those words came back. Halvor Brekke had not always been a man who talked to wind. 8 months before that autumn of 1898, he had been a husband, a tie cutter for the Union Pacific Spur south of Hayes, and a man with a plan written in pencil on the back of a seed invoice. File on 160 acres in Greeley County. Break sod in spring, plant coffee or corn and sorghum by May, prove up the claim in 5 years, and give his children something that was not a rented room above a railroad depot. The plan had not included burying his wife. Christy Brekke died on the 14th of March, 1898, 4 days after delivering a stillborn son in the back of a neighbor's wagon because the doctor in Tribune was 22 miles away and the mud was axle deep. The fever took her on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Halvor stood in the doorway of the depot room with Marit pulling at his trouser leg and Tolef coughing into a rag, and he understood that the plan had not changed. The plan had simply lost the only person who made it possible. He filed anyway. $11 remained after the filing fee and the seed debt he owed to a merchant in Hayes named Pomeroy. The 160 acres sat on a shallow rise in Greeley County, 22 miles northwest of Tribune, where the nearest timber was a cottonwood draw 12 miles south, and the nearest neighbor was Matilda Crowell, a mile and a quarter east. The cabin was a frame Halvor had started during a September visit the previous year, 16 by 18 feet, cottonwood poles for the ridge, sod roof, 3 walls up, north wall half chinked with mud that had cracked and fallen out over winter. The door faced south. The stove was a cast iron box with a cracked pipe joint that leaked smoke when the wind came from the northwest, which in western Kansas meant most of the time. He arrived in April with the children, the mare, a trunk of tools, and a flour tin containing the deed paper, $4 in coin, and a letter from Christy's mother in Minnesota that said simply, "Come home. This is no place for children." He did not go home. Home was the quarter section. Home was the thing Christy had wanted before the mud and the fever and the silence that followed. He owed her that, or he owed himself the belief that he owed her that. And in the difference between those two debts lived every decision he would make for the next 5 years. By October, the sorghum had failed. The Kaffir corn gave a thin stand that the grasshoppers thinned further. He had $7 from selling the mare's foal to a freighter passing through, minus the 12 he owed Pomeroy, which meant he was $5 in debt and entering winter with less than 1 cord of cottonwood stacked against the south wall, a stove that ate fuel like a starving dog, and 2 children who needed to eat every single day whether the wind blew or not. The math was simple. The math was impossible. A cabin with 3 finger-wide gaps in the north wall and a cracked stovepipe would need 6 cords of wood minimum to survive a Kansas winter, and 6 cords of cottonwood meant 72 trips to the creek, draw 12 miles south, which meant 144 miles of hauling with a mare whose left foreleg swelled after 10, which meant the wood alone would take longer than the weeks remaining before the ground froze hard enough to ring like iron under a boot heel. He had less than 1 cord. He needed 6. He had a lame mare. He had no money. He had 2 children, and the north wind was already finding every gap in the wall and whistling through the cabin like it owned the place. That was when Alpheus Markham came. Markham did not knock. Men did not knock on the plains when they could see through the wall. He rode a bay gelding with a Union cavalry brand on the hip, dismounted with the careful weight of a man whose knees had seen 61 winters, and stood in Halvor's dooryard with his cane planted in the dirt and his hat pushed back so the October sun lit the scar tissue on his left ear where frostbite had taken the lobe in 1886. He had not come to be cruel. That was the thing Halvor understood later, and the thing that made Markham's words cut deeper than cruelty ever could. Markham had come because he saw children inside a bad cabin, and he remembered what winter did to children inside bad cabins. He had lost 11 head of cattle in the blizzard of '86. He had found a family named Olson frozen in their dugout 3 miles from his place because the stove had gone out and the wind had packed snow through the roof seams until the room filled like a bowl. He carried that memory the way other men carried a pocket watch, always present, always ticking, always reminding him what time it really was. He walked the north wall without asking permission. He pressed his thumb into the chinking gaps. He looked at the stovepipe and the place where the sod roof met the cottonwood ridgepole and the single cord of wood stacked against the south face. Then he turned to Halvor, and his voice was not unkind, but it was the voice of a man who had stopped believing in miracles sometime around 1887. "You have a stovepipe that leaks," Markham said. "One thin roof, no timber break. A north wind will walk through this house like a hired man." Halvor said nothing. He was holding a horseshoe nail he had been using to tighten the stove bolts, and he turned it between his fingers the way he turned problems and slowly feeling for the weak point. "You need a timber palisade on the north side," Markham continued. 8-foot posts, 3 inches thick, set 2 feet deep, packed with sod between. That is 40 posts minimum for a 16-foot wall. Where are your posts? "I do not have posts," Halvor said. "Then you need a sod bank, 4 feet high, 3 feet thick at the base, running the full north face. That is 2 days of cutting with a breaking plow and a team. Where is your team?" "I have 1 mare. She is lame." Markham looked at the mare. The mare looked at Markham with the resigned patience of an animal that had already calculated the odds and found them poor. Markham looked at the woodpile. Less than a cord. He looked at the children. Marit stood in the doorway with her hand on Tolef's shoulder, and Tolef coughed into his fist, and the cough had the wet rattle of a boy who had been sick since spring and was not getting better. "How much money do you have?" Markham asked. $7. I owe 12. Markham put his hat back on. The scar on his ear disappeared into shadow. "Brecca," he said, "I am not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you what I have seen. In '86, the wind came at 40 miles an hour for 3 days. 6-foot drifts covered doors. Temperatures went to 30 below. 100 people died on these plains, and most of them had more than you have now. The ones who lived had timber, sod, hay, or neighbors with timber, sod, and hay. You have none of those things." "I have time," Halvor said. "You have weeks," Markham replied. "Weeks is not time. Weeks is the sound time makes when it is leaving." He mounted the gelding. Before he turned, he looked at Marit. She had not moved from the doorway. She had not spoken. But she was watching Markham with the focused attention of a child who understood that this man was deciding whether her family would live or die, and she was memorizing every word so she could repeat it to herself later when the wind came through the wall. Markham said, "If you cannot protect this cabin, bring the children to my place before December. I will take them through winter. You can have them back in spring if you are still here." He rode east. The dust from his horse settled on the stovepipe and on Halvor's shoulders and on the question that now hung in the cabin like smoke. If the man who survived 1886 said Halvor could not survive 1898, what exactly did Halvor know that Markham did not? The answer at that moment was nothing. Halvor knew nothing that Markham did not know. He knew only that he could not send his children away, and he could not leave the claim, and he could not buy timber, and he could not cut sod without a team, and he could not haul 6 cords of cottonwood with a lame mare, and he could not stop winter from coming. He stood in the dooryard after Markham left and watched dust curl behind a broken crate near the woodpile. The wind caught the dust and pulled it south in a thin ribbon that broke apart, reformed, broke again. He watched it for a long time. Marit brought him a cup of water, and he drank it without looking away from the dust. He did not know yet what he was watching, but something in the way the wind handled small things, dust, straw, the frayed edge of a rag on a nail, was filing itself into the part of his mind where problems lived. He had spent 2 years cutting railroad ties and repairing wagon boxes, and in that work he had learned one thing that Markham, for all his experience, had never needed to learn. When you cannot afford the right material, you study the problem until the wrong material becomes right. 3 days after Markham's visit, Del Royston rode up. Royston was not the kind of man who dismounted unless he planned to stay, and he did not plan to stay. He sat his horse in Halvor's dooryard and looked at the cabin the way a man looks at a thing he intends to own. His leather was good, his horse was fed, his hat was new enough to hold its shape. Everything about Royston said that the world had arranged itself to his satisfaction, and he intended to keep it that way. "Brecka," he said, "I hear you're in a hard spot." Halvor was patching Marit's shoe with a strip of harness leather. He did not look up. "I am in a spot," he said. "I have not decided how hard it is." Royston leaned on his saddle horn. "I will give you $28 for the quarter section. Cash. I will throw in a wagon ride to Tribune and a letter to the depot agent in Hayes for work. You can have the children in a warm room by November." $28. The filing fee alone had been $14. The seed debt was $12. $28 would clear the debt and leave $2 for a ticket east, and nothing else. No land, no cabin, no claim, no future that did not belong to someone else's railroad or someone else's farm. "That is a generous offer," Halvor said. And he meant it because Royston was not stupid, and $28 for 160 acres of unproven grassland in Greeley County was exactly the price a man pays when he knows the seller has no choice. Marit had been sitting on the trunk, sorting nails by size the way Halvor had taught her. She looked up. Does East have trees?" she asked. Halvor looked at his daughter. 9 years old, hands already rough from work, eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She was not asking about trees. She was asking whether East was a place where they would be safe, and she was asking it in front of Royston because she wanted to see what her father's face did when he answered. "Yes," Halvor said. "East has trees." "Then why did we come west?" Halvor did not answer her. He folded the deed paper, put it back in the flour tin, and turned to Royston. "I'm keeping the claim," he said. Royston smiled the way men smile when they have heard what they expected. "Winter will make that decision for you, Brecka. I will ask again in January. The price will be lower." He rode west toward the grass he was leasing from the county, and Halvor watched him go, and he understood something that Markham's visit had not made clear. Markham wanted Halvor to survive. Royston wanted Halvor to fail. The difference between those two men was the difference between a warning and a threat, and both of them pointed to the same conclusion. Halvor could not protect his cabin with the tools he had. He needed a different tool. He needed something that existed in quantities large enough to matter, something free, something the prairie itself would deliver to his door. He did not yet know what that something was, but the dust was still curling behind the broken crate, and the wind was still finding the gaps in the wall, and somewhere in the space between those two facts lived an idea that had not yet found its shape. The realization came through failure. Halvor spent the first week of November trying to build conventional protection. He cut sod blocks from a patch of buffalo grass south of the cabin and stacked them against the north wall. The blocks were dry. The summer had been hot, and the autumn rain had not come, and the grass roots had not knit the soil the way they would have in a wet year. By the second day, the blocks were crumbling. By the third, the wind had taken the top two courses and scattered them across the yard like broken teeth. He tried the cottonwood. He loaded the mare with a rope harness and walked her south toward the creek draw, 12 miles across open grass. The mare went lame at mile 7, the same left foreleg, swollen at the fetlock, hot to the touch. Halvor fashioned a poultice from mud and torn shirt cloth and waited 3 hours. The mare limped another mile. He cut 4 crooked poles, none longer than 8 feet, none thicker than his wrist. He dragged them home by hand, leaving the mare to graze and follow. When he reached the cabin after dark, Marit had the stove burning and Tollef was asleep with his mouth open, and the wet rattle in his chest was louder than the fire. 4 poles. He needed 40 for a palisade. He had 4. The math had not changed. The math had gotten worse. That night, the wind drove powder snow under the door. Marit laid a blanket along the sill and weighted it with the horseshoe nail tin and a stone she had carried from the creek. By morning, the blanket was frozen stiff. The snow had found a way through anyway. A thin white line traced the base of the north wall, curving where the gaps were widest, and the line looked like the signature of something patient and methodical that was testing the cabin's weakness the way a man tests a fence post with his hand. Halvor looked at the snow line. He looked at the frozen blanket. He looked at the 4 crooked poles leaning against the south wall and the crumbled sod blocks scattered in the yard. Everything he had tried was a version of the same idea. Put something solid between the wind and the cabin. And everything he had tried had failed because he did not have enough solid things. He stood in the dooryard and let the wind hit him full in the chest. It was not the worst wind he had felt, but it was steady, and it was cold, and it carried a fine grit of ice crystals that stung his face and found the gaps between his collar and his neck. He closed his eyes and felt it. Wind was not a wall. Wind was a river. It did not push equally everywhere. It found the path of least resistance and poured through it, and where it could not pour, it climbed, and where it could not climb, it broke into eddies and curls that scattered in directions the main flow never intended. He had seen this on the railroad. He had seen how a pile of ties stacked beside the track would collect snow on one side and leave the other bare, and how a gap between 2 piles would create a jet of wind that cut a trench in the drift. Wind did not care about walls. Wind cared about flow. The next morning, he rode the mare at a walk toward the southeast, following the line of a wire fence that marked a cattle lease. The mare's limp was better. The sky was the color of old tin. 3 miles out, he found what he was looking for. A fence corner where the wire met a post at right angles, and in the angle a mass of tumbleweeds had piled 2 weeks of wind's delivery into a chest-high tangle of dry stalks, thorned branches, and seed heads the color of rust. He almost rode past it. He had seen tumbleweeds piled against fences his entire life on the plains. Everyone had. They were a nuisance, a fire hazard, a symbol of abandonment. Russian thistle, the settlers called it, though it was not a thistle and it had stopped being Russian the moment it escaped the flaxseed shipment that brought it to South Dakota in the 1870s. It grew everywhere, died everywhere, broke from its roots, and tumbled everywhere, and piled against every vertical surface the wind could push it toward. It was the most useless, most abundant, most despised plant on the Great Plains. But behind the tumbleweed pile, the ground was calm. Halvor dismounted. He walked around the pile. On the windward side, the air pushed hard against his chest, and the ice grit stung his eyes. On the lee side, the air was still, not warm, not sheltered in the way a building shelters, but still. The wind had hit the pile, and something had happened to it. Not a clean stop, the way a wall stops a thrown stone, but a disruption, a tangling, a confusion of direction that left the air behind the pile moving slowly and without force. He knelt. The snow on the lee side was different. It lay in a smooth, curved drift, thickest close to the pile and tapering to nothing over a distance of perhaps 12 feet. On the windward side, the ground was scoured bare. The wind had carried the snow into the pile, and the pile had taken the snow's speed and dropped it gently on the far side, like a hand closing over a thrown coin. He pushed his bare fingers into the lee side snow. No wind. He held his hand flat. The air moved, but barely. He could feel it the way you feel breath on your wrist from a sleeping child, present, but without force. His father's voice came to him from a winter in Norway that was 20 years and 4,000 miles away. Halvor had been 11, and his father had been pressing spruce branches into the pen where the yews stood against the north wall, shivering in the blue light of a December afternoon. The branches were loose, not woven tight, and young Halvor had said they were not thick enough to stop the wind. His father had pressed his palm flat against the loose brush and said, "I'm not stopping the wind. I'm giving the snow a quiet place to choose." Snow chooses the quiet place. That was what his father had said. And now, kneeling beside a pile of dead weeds in western Kansas, with ice melting on his knuckles, Halvor understood what the words meant. A solid wall fights the wind, and the wind fights back. It climbs over, it jets under, it hammers until something breaks. But a porous barrier, a tangled, ragged, imperfect barrier full of gaps and holes and irregular shapes, does something different. It ruins the wind. It takes the wind's organized force and turns it into 1,000 small, confused movements that cancel each other out. And in the confusion, the snow falls, and behind the barrier, the air goes quiet. He did not need a wall. He needed a ruin. He drove 2 forked sticks into the ground near the fence corner and packed 3 tumbleweeds between them. He threw a handful of dirt into the wind and watched it hit the weeds, break, spin, and fall in a scatter pattern behind the sticks. He moved the sticks closer together. The wind slammed over the top in a clean sheet and hit the ground hard on the other side. Too solid. He moved them farther apart. The weeds rolled out and tumbled away. Too loose. He tried again. 5 feet apart. 3 layers of weeds packed between. Thorned crowns turned inward so they locked together, stems crossing, gaps visible but irregular. He threw dirt again. The dirt hit the weeds and scattered. Some went through, some curled over the top, some fell at the base. But behind the sticks, the dirt fell slowly, like dust settling in a still room. The wind was not stopped. The wind was spent. He sat on his heels in the cold and scratched numbers into a flat stone with a horseshoe nail, 5-foot gap between stake rows. Rows 4 feet apart along the line. 3 layers of weeds, thorned crowns inward, top lashed with wire. Height, 6 feet before drifting. He did not know if 6 feet was enough. He did not know if tumbleweeds would hold under real wind or collapse into loose trash. He did not know if the fire risk would kill him before the cold did. He knew only that he had just watched the wind lose a fight with dead weeds, and he had nothing else to fight with. Matilda Crowell found him the next day. She was a practical woman, 37 years old, with two sons aged 14 and 11, and a husband who had gone to Colorado for mine work in '96 and never come back. She ran her claim alone, which meant she understood exactly how many hours existed in a day and how many of them a person could fill with labor before the body simply stopped cooperating. She liked Halvor because he did not waste words, and she trusted him because he had once walked 4 miles in a rainstorm to help her reset a fence post without being asked. But liking and trusting a man did not mean agreeing with him, and when she saw Halvor dragging a rope-netted bundle of tumbleweeds behind the limping mare, she pulled her wagon alongside and said what she was thinking. "You are fencing yourself inside tinder," she said. Halvor kept walking. The mare kept limping. The tumbleweed scraped across the dry grass and left a trail of broken stems and scattered seed. "Halvor," she said, "one spark, one ember from that cracked pipe, one lightning strike within 50 yards. You will have a ring of fire around your children." "I know," he said. "Then what are you doing?" He stopped the mare. He looked at Matilda. She was not laughing at him. She was not dismissing him. She was afraid for him, which was worse because her fear was earned and specific and based on something real. Tumbleweeds burned. Everyone knew tumbleweeds burned. Cowboys used them for kindling. Prairie fires consumed them in seconds. Building a wall of tumbleweeds around a cabin with 2 children inside was the kind of idea that made sense only if you had already eliminated every other option and were willing to manage a risk that could not be eliminated, only controlled. "I am going to scrape a fire break," Halvor said. 12 feet wide, bare earth, nothing between the wall and the cabin that can carry flame. The ash barrel goes 40 paces downwind. The stovepipe gets a spark screen from wire mesh. The south entry stays open so we can get out. And I am going to wet the interface of the wall with snow melt every week after the first snow, because wet weeds do not catch the same way dry ones do. Matilda looked at him for a long moment. "You have thought about this," she said. "I have thought about nothing else for 4 days. And if it burns anyway, then I will be no worse off than I am now. I have no wall at all, Matilda. A wall that might burn is better than a wall that does not exist." She clicked her tongue, and the wagon moved forward. Over her shoulder, she said, "If your children come running to my place in the night, I will take them in, but I would rather they did not have to run." She was right about the fire. She would be right about the fire for every day that the wall stood. The risk was real, and it was permanent, and it could not be engineered away entirely, only managed down to a level that was less dangerous than the alternative. Halvor understood this. He added it to the list of things that could kill him and moved it below the wind and the cold and the gaps in the wall, because those things were killing him right now, today, and the fire was a future problem that he could address with a shovel and a 12-foot strip of bare earth. He dragged the tumbleweeds home. He began stacking. At Pritchard's store in Tribune, Halvor bought 2 pounds of staples, 3 coils of used baling wire, and a sack of bent nails for $1.40. He did not explain what the materials were for. He did not need to. Del Royston was leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee that someone else had paid for, and he watched Halvor count coins with the careful attention of a man watching an investment mature. "Here you are building a fence, Brecka," Royston said. "I'm building a windbreak," Halvor said, "out of tumbleweeds." Halvor said nothing. He picked up his materials and turned toward the door. Royston raised his voice. Not for Halvor, for the room. "A garbage fence," he said. A garbage fence keeps out nothing but good sense. 3 men laughed. Ned Pritchard, the storekeeper, did not laugh, but he did not contradict Royston either. A man who owed Royston cattle lease payments did not contradict Royston about anything, including the weather. The laughter carried the particular weight of men who had earned their survival through conventional means: sod, timber, hay, money, and who saw in Halvor's plan not innovation but desperation dressed up as cleverness. Markham was there. He had come for salt and stayed for gossip, and he spoke not with mockery, but with the heavy certainty of a man correcting a dangerous error. "Your fence will either burn or it will trap snow against your door," he said. "Either way, the children are inside." Matilda's oldest son, Garrett, was loading flour into his mother's wagon outside. He heard the conversation through the open door. That evening, children on 3 claims were repeating the phrase, "garbage fence." Merritt heard it from a boy at the creek draw. She came home and did not repeat it, but Halvor saw the way she looked at the first row of stakes he had driven into the ground, and he knew. Tolliff asked at supper. "Are we poor?" he said. Halvor looked at his son. 5 years old, thin, the cough still there, rattling in his chest like a seed in a dry pod. "No," Halvor said. "Garrett said we have a garbage fence." "Garrett does not know what it is for yet," Halvor said. "When people do not know what something is for, they use the worst word they can think of." It was not enough. It would never be enough to protect his children from the knowledge that their father was the man building a wall of dead weeds while other men built real things. But it was all he had, and he said it. And Tolliff ate his cornbread and coughed and went to sleep with his face turned toward the stove, and Halvor went outside and stood in the dark and listened to the wind testing the first row of stakes and the tumbleweeds he had packed between them. And the sound the wind made was not the sound of something breaking through. It was the sound of something breaking apart. He went back inside. He picked up the horseshoe nail. He tightened the stove bolts. And in the morning, he went back to work. The construction began in earnest on the 9th of November. The plan was clear in Halvor's mind, scratched onto a stove board in numbers he checked every morning. An enclosure roughly 90 feet by 70 feet, large enough to surround the cabin, the wood rack, the privy path, and a lean-to he would build for the mare when the walls were high enough to matter. Total perimeter, 320 feet. 2 parallel rows of stakes, 5 feet apart, running the full perimeter. That meant 160 stakes at 4-foot spacing, plus corner braces. Between the stake rows, 3 layers of tumbleweeds packed crown inward and lashed with wire. Target height, 6 feet. Total weeds needed somewhere between 500 and 600, sorted by size. He had 37. He gathered at dawn when the night wind pushed tumbleweeds across the flats like slow, scratching animals. He rode the mare at a careful walk along shallow draws and fence lines, hooking rolling thistles with a forked cottonwood pole and dragging them home in bundles roped to the saddle. The work was slow. The mare could handle only small loads. Many weeds were too small or too rotten to be useful. Some crumbled when he tried to pack them. Others were so thorned that his forearms bled through his shirt sleeves within the first hour. Marit kept count. She scratched tally marks on a fence post with a nail. 73 by the end of the first week, 140 by the middle of the second, 212 by the 23rd of November, when the first hard frost turned the ground white at dawn and did not melt until noon. Each number was progress. Each number was insufficient. He needed 500 minimum and he was averaging 30 a day, and winter was not waiting for his schedule. The first sustained cold would freeze the ground, lock the fence post holes, and make stake driving impossible with anything short of a sledgehammer he did not own. He was in a race against the calendar, and the calendar was winning. The physical cost was immediate. His forearms swelled with thorn scratches that cracked and bled and cracked again. His eyes puffed from the dust that rose from every weed he handled. His shirt cuffs stiffened with burrs that worked through the cloth and into his skin. His back ached from the bending and lifting and dragging, and at night he sat on the cabin floor, and Marit pulled thorns from his palms with the tip of the horseshoe nail while Tolef slept, and the stove ticked, and the wind pressed against the north wall like a hand testing a door. He was building too slowly. He knew it. Marit knew it. The tally marks on the fence post were a record of effort, but they were also a record of the gap between what he had and what he needed. 212 weeds, 300 more to go. The temperature was dropping 3 degrees every week. The first real storm could come any day. And no one was helping. Markham had not returned. Matilda brought food once, a pot of bean soup and a loaf of bread, but she did not offer labor because she had her own claim to protect and her own children to feed and her own winter to survive. Royston's phrase had done its work. The man building the garbage fence was the man you watched from a distance, the way you watch someone doing something foolish, with interest, but without involvement. Halvor drove stakes alone. He packed weeds alone. He lashed wire alone. He made mistakes alone. A corner post set too shallow that leaned in the first stiff gust, a section packed too tight that the wind hit like a sail instead of filtering through, a stretch of wire that snapped because the cold had made it brittle, and he had not thought to warm it first. He corrected each mistake. He reset the corner post with a deeper hole and a diagonal brace. He loosened the too tight section and repacked it with gaps. He spliced the broken wire with a twist joint that held. Each correction cost time he did not have, and each correction taught him something about how wind and weeds and wire behaved together that he could not have learned any other way. By the 26th of November, the north wall of the enclosure stood at 4 feet. 42 feet of packed tumbleweed, staked and wired, with a 12-foot bare earth fire break between the wall and the cabin. It was not 6 feet. It was not 320 feet. It was not enough. But when Halvor stood inside the partial enclosure and faced north, the wind that hit his face was different. It was there, but it was slower, and it came from odd angles instead of straight on, and the fine grit of ice crystals that usually stung his eyes was falling at his feet instead of driving into them. The weeds were working. Not enough. Not yet. But they were working. And somewhere between the 26th of November and the 1st of December, Halvor Brekka stopped being a man trying an idea and became a man racing to finish one. If you have ever built something that everyone around you said was foolish, tell us about it in the comments. Because what happens next to Halvor's wall will test every doubt and every promise this fence has made. The stakes were driven, the wire was strung. The weeds were piling up at 30 a day, 31, 28 on a bad day, when the mare refused the harness and Halvor dragged bundles on foot. 320 feet of perimeter and less than 50 feet stood at full height, and the sky was the color of something that had made up its mind. Winter was not coming. Winter was here, and the fence was not finished. The man who changed everything arrived on the 2nd of December, and he did not arrive with charity. Orrin Voss came walking from the southeast on a morning so cold that the air itself seemed to have weight. He was 58 years old, thin in the way that men who have worked outdoors their entire lives are thin, not starved but pared down, every unnecessary thing burned off by decades of wind and labor, and the particular economy of a body that has learned to spend nothing it does not need to spend. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows with leather, boots that had been resoled twice, and a hat so shapeless it might have been a rag with ambition. He carried a bedroll on his back and a walking stick cut from a piece of rail-tie oak, and he was coughing. The cough was the first thing Halvor noticed. Not the man. The cough. It came from deep in the chest. The kind of cough that does not clear anything but simply announces that something inside is broken and will not be repaired. Halvor had heard coughs like that on the railroad. Men who breathed coal smoke and tie creosote for years until their lungs gave up trying to clean themselves and settled for a permanent argument with the air. Voss stopped at the edge of Halvor's enclosure and looked at what he saw. He did not speak. He walked the north face of the tumbleweed wall the way Markham had walked the cabin wall, carefully, measuring with his eyes, pressing his hand against the packed weeds, pulling at the wire lashings, testing the stake depth with the heel of his boot. He knelt at a corner brace and examined the angle. He stood and looked at the fire break. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the stovepipe with its jury-rigged spark screen made from bent wire mesh. Then he picked up a handful of dry dirt, walked to the windward side of the north wall, and threw the dirt into the wind. Halvor watched from the doorway. The dirt hit the tumbleweed face, scattered, broke into a dozen separate streams. Some passed through the gaps, some curled over the top, some fell at the base. On the lee side, the dirt settled slowly, dispersing in a pattern that was neither clean nor random, but something between the two, like water poured into still water. Voss threw a second handful, higher. He watched where it went. He threw a third handful at a section where Halvor had packed the weeds tighter, and here the dirt pattern was different. More of it climbed over the top in a concentrated stream and came down hard on the other side. Voss nodded at the tight section and shook his head. "Too solid here," he said. His voice was rough from the cough and from years of speaking over wind and machinery. "You have about a third of this wall packed like you are trying to stop the wind. You are not trying to stop the wind." Halvor came out of the doorway. "What am I trying to do?" Voss looked at him. His eyes were pale blue and deeply set, and they had the particular quality of eyes that have spent decades squinting into weather and have learned to see things that other eyes miss. The angle of a snowdrift, the lean of a fence post, the way a rail bed settles after a season of freight. He studied Halvor the way he had studied the wall, and whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "You are trying to spend it," Voss said. "You are trying to take organized wind and make it disorganized. A solid wall takes the full shove. The wind pushes, the wall pushes back, and one of them wins. With your weeds, the wind hits the barrier and breaks into 100 small pieces that fight each other. None of them have enough force to do damage. The wind spends itself arguing with itself." He coughed again. The cough lasted 10 seconds. He did not apologize for it or explain it or acknowledge it in any way. "Where did you learn this?" Halvor asked. "Union Pacific, Wyoming, and western Nebraska. I built snow fences for 14 years. He tapped a stake with his walking stick. "Rail company puts up board fences along cuts and grades where drifting snow blocks the tracks. I have watched snow hit 1,000 fences. The ones that work are never solid. The ones that work have gaps." He looked at the tight section again. "If I loosen that for you, will you feed me supper?" That was how it began. Not charity, not kindness delivered from above. A trade. A man who knew something offering it in exchange for a meal, and a man who needed something recognizing the value of what was offered. Halvor said yes, and Orrin Voss set down his bedroll inside the enclosure, and by nightfall the tight section had been repacked with wider gaps, and the wall behaved differently. The wind passed through it with a sound like breathing instead of the sound like a fist. Orrin stayed. He did not ask to stay, and Halvor did not ask him to stay. He simply did not leave. He slept on the cabin floor near the stove, and the stove's heat helped his cough, and Marit brought him water without being told, and Toluf watched him with the fascinated attention of a child who has not seen a new adult in months. The first lesson came on the third day. Orin waited until dusk. He told Halvor to light the lantern and hold it behind the packed weeds at arm's height. Halvor held it. On the windward side, Orin walked the wall, looking through the weeds at the lantern on the other side. "What do you see?" Halvor called. "Move left," Orin said. Halvor moved. "Stop. Hold it there." Silence. Then, "That section is good. I can see the light, but I cannot see the flame. The glow comes through broken and scattered. That means the wind will come through the same way. Broken and scattered. Now move to your right, 4 paces. Halvor moved. The lantern swung. "There," Orin said. "That section is too tight. The light disappears completely. If I cannot see the lantern at all, the fence is a wall. It will take the full force of a strong gust, and the stakes will not hold. Loosen it." They walked the entire north face that night, section by section, holding the lantern behind each 4-foot span and checking whether the light came through broken or disappeared entirely. Where the light vanished, they pulled weeds and repacked. Where the light poured through unimpeded, they added a layer. The goal was a fence that scattered the lantern glow, not blocked it, not let it stream, but broke it into fragments that were visible but formless. It was a way of measuring porosity with nothing more than a flame and a pair of eyes, and it was more precise than anything Halvor had imagined. "About half and half," Orin said when they finished. "Half light, half weed. That is the number you are looking for. If a strong gust hits this fence and half the air passes through in pieces, the other half goes over the top. Neither half has enough force to do damage on the other side. The snow that the wind is carrying drops at the base, and the air behind the fence goes quiet." "How quiet?" Halvor asked. "Quiet enough that your stove can keep up. Quiet enough that the snow does not drive through your wall gaps. Quiet enough that your children can open the door without the wind taking it off the hinges." He paused. "Maybe quiet enough to save your lives. Maybe not. I have seen fences work in 40-mile winds and fail in 60. I cannot promise you 60. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Halvor since Markham's visit. Markham had said the cabin would fail. Royston had said the claim was not worth keeping. Matilda had said the fence would burn. Orin said, "This might work, or it might not, and the difference is in the details you can still control." It was not comfort. It was respect. It was one working man telling another working man the truth about the margins they were operating in. The second lesson came 5 days later, after a gust ripped the northeast corner loose and sent 30 feet of packed weeds rolling across the yard like a breaking wave. Halvor stood in the wreckage at dawn and felt the weight of 5 days' work scattered around him like dead things. The stakes had held. The wire had held. But the corner brace had rotated in the ground under the lateral pressure of the gust, and when the brace went, the weeds between the stake rows lost their compression, and the wind pulled them out like a hand pulling cotton from a bowl. Orin walked the damage without speaking. He knelt at the failed corner and examined the brace hole. He dug with his fingers and pulled out the brace. A single vertical stake with a horizontal crosspiece wired to it. The crosspiece was too short. The bearing surface was too small. The ground was too loose. "Deadman anchor," he said. He drew in the dirt with his walking stick. A diagonal brace running from the corner stake to a buried cross pole 3 feet underground and 4 feet back from the fence line. The cross pole would be 2 feet long, buried perpendicular to the brace, with dirt packed hard above it. The pull of the wind on the corner would travel down the brace and into the buried pole, and the weight of the earth above the pole would hold it. The deeper the burial, the stronger the anchor. He made Halvor dig. 3 feet down, the ground was not frozen yet. They had perhaps 2 weeks before the frost line reached that depth. Halvor buried a cross pole made from one of his 4 cottonwood pieces and ran a diagonal brace of twisted wire from the corner stake to the buried wood. Orrin made him twist the wire tight with a stick until it hummed when he plucked it. "Pull it," Orrin said. Halvor pulled the corner stake. The wire sang. The stake did not move. "Now do every corner," Orrin said, "and the midpoints of the long runs, 8 dead man anchors minimum. 12 if you have the wood." Halvor had 4 cottonwood poles. He had used 1. He needed 11 more. He looked at Orrin, and Orrin looked at him, and neither of them said what was obvious. The creek draw was 12 miles away, and the mare was lame, and the ground was freezing. "Railroad ties," Orrin said. "There is a siding 11 miles northeast where they pulled up a spur last spring. The ties are stacked. Nobody wants them because they are split and creosote soaked. Creosote does not rot underground. It is the best anchor wood you will find." They went the next day. Orrin rode the mare at a walk, and Halvor walked alongside, and they brought back 6 split ties roped to a drag frame made from 2 of the remaining cottonwood poles. The mare limped but held. The ties were heavy and foul-smelling and perfect. By the following evening, Halvor had 8 dead man anchors buried at the corners and midpoints, each one braced with twisted wire that hummed in the wind like a strange instrument tuned to a note no one had asked to hear. The 3rd lesson was the most important, and it came through an argument. Halvor had been building the enclosure with the tumbleweed wall as close to the cabin as the firebreak allowed, 12 feet from the north wall, 15 from the east and west. He wanted the protection tight. He wanted the quiet air close to the cabin where it mattered most. Orrin said he was wrong. They stood on the south side of the enclosure on a cold morning in mid-December, and Orrin drew in the frost-white dirt with his stick. "A snow fence does not keep snow away," he said. "A snow fence tells snow where to fall. The snow that the wind carries hits your wall and loses its ride. It drops. Where does it drop?" "At the base of the wall," Halvor said, "on the windward side. And on the lee side, and on top. The drift builds from the wall outward on both sides, but the lee drift is longer and deeper. In a real storm, the lee drift will reach 12 to 15 feet from the base, maybe more if the wind holds for 2 days." He drew a curved line in the dirt. "If your wall sits 12 feet from the cabin, the lee drift will reach the door. It will pack against the north wall. It will climb the sod roof. You will be buried." Halvor looked at the north wall of the enclosure. 42 feet of packed tumbleweed staked and wired and anchored, the best work he had done. 12 feet from the cabin. "How far back should it be?" he asked. 25 feet minimum. 30 is better." "That means tearing out the north wall and rebuilding it farther out." "Yes." "That means 200 more feet of perimeter, more stakes, more weeds, more wire." "Yes." Halvor stood very still. The wind pressed against his back. Inside the cabin, Tolef coughed. The sound carried through the gaps in the wall the way every sound carried through every gap in every wall Halvor had ever built. Small and persistent and impossible to stop. "We do not have time," Halvor said. "You do not have time to be buried alive either," Orrin said. It was not a gentle correction. It was a flat statement of consequence delivered without padding, and it landed the way flat statements of consequence land, hard in the chest, where the air goes out and the choice goes in. Halvor could keep the wall where it was and risk burial, or he could tear it out and rebuild it and risk not finishing before the real cold came. Both options were bad. Both options could kill his children. He tore it out. It took 2 days to pull the north wall stakes, reposition them 30 feet from the cabin, and begin repacking. 2 days of work undone and redone in cold that was now reaching 10 degrees at night and not climbing past 30 during the day. Oren helped. He could not swing a mallet. His arms did not have the strength, but he could pack weeds and twist wire and hold stakes while Halvor drove them. They worked in silence that was not uncomfortable but necessary, the silence of men doing physical labor together who understand that words cost energy and energy is finite. Marit helped too. She dragged weeds from the collection pile to the wall line, sorted by size the way Halvor had taught her. Large ones for the base layer, medium for the middle, small and thorny for the top where the crown locking held best. She did not complain about the thorns. She did not complain about the cold. She kept tally marks on the fence post, and at night she told Halvor the new count in the same flat voice she used for everything that mattered. 341. 341. He needed 550. The ground was freezing. The sky was iron. The calendar was December 15th, and the wind had teeth. Setbacks came in clusters, the way they always come. On December 17th, a spark from the stove landed on a section of the east wall where the fire break had narrowed because Halvor had piled supplies too close. The dry weeds caught instantly. Flame climbed the packed tumbleweed face in 3 seconds and spread laterally in 5. Halvor was inside the cabin when Marit screamed. He came through the door with the water bucket. Matilda Crowell was already there. She had been bringing a pot of soup and had seen the smoke. She beat the flames with wet sacking while Halvor threw water and then dirt. 12 feet of the east wall burned to black wire and ash. The fire stopped at a gap where 2 sections met imperfectly, a gap Halvor had considered a flaw and now considered a fire break. Matilda stood in the smoke with soot on her face and the wet sack dripping. "I told you," she said, but she said it without triumph. She said it the way a woman says something she wishes she had been wrong about. "I know," Halvor said. "It will happen again." "Then why?" "Because cold is certain and fire is possible. I will take possible over certain." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Build gaps into the wall every 20 feet. Intentional gaps, a foot wide. No weeds, no wire. If a section catches, the fire stops at the gap." It was the best idea anyone had given Halvor since Oren's dead man anchors. He built the gaps the next day. 12 of them, spaced around the perimeter, each one a foot-wide break in the tumbleweed packing where nothing could carry flame from one section to the next. They weakened the wind protection slightly. They made the structure survivable. On December 20th, a steer from Royston's leased herd broke through the south approach and destroyed 30 feet of the outer stake row. The animal was half mad with cold and disorientation, and it plowed through the weeds and wire like a living battering ram before Halvor and Oren turned it with shouts and a thrown bucket. The damage was structural. Stakes snapped, wire tangled, weeds scattered across the yard in a mess that took a full day to clean and 2 days to rebuild. On December 23rd, a freezing rain coated the entire wall with a 1/4 inch of ice. The weeds, already heavy with packed snow from 2 small storms, sagged under the additional weight. 3 sections in the northeast corner collapsed inward, pulling stakes out of frozen ground that would not release its grip on the dead man anchors, but surrendered the shallower stake holes without resistance. Halvor and Oren spent Christmas Eve resetting stakes in ground they had to crack with a railroad spike and a stone because the mallet handle had split. Oren's cough worsened. The cold air carved at his lungs, and the labor compressed what little breath he had left. He worked in shorter stretches now, an hour of packing, then 10 minutes inside by the stove, then another hour. He did not complain. He did not reduce the quality of his work. He simply acknowledged the limits of his body the way a man acknowledges the limits of any tool, without sentiment, with adjustment. On December 26th, Halvor coughed blood, not from his lungs, from his throat, raw and cracked from breathing ice crystal air through an open mouth while driving stakes. He spat red into the snow and kept working. Marit saw it. She did not say anything. She brought him water with a spoonful of honey, the last honey they had, and he drank it, and the sweetness burned his torn throat, and he went back to the stakes. Unexpected help arrived in disguises. Matilda's sons left a bundle of willow switches by the south entry one morning, thin, flexible rods perfect for weaving between tumbleweed layers to add structure. No note, no acknowledgement, just willow switches and boot prints leading east toward the Crowell place. Orrin produced 2 railroad spikes from his bedroll and a coil of discarded telegraph wire he had carried from the siding. "I was saving these for trade goods," he said. "This is better than trade." The telegraph wire was a revelation. Thinner and stronger than baling wire, it held knots tighter and resisted cold brittleness better. Halvor used it for the top lashing where the wind's pull was strongest, and the improvement was immediate. Sections that had sagged under ice load held firm when relashed with telegraph wire. By the 29th of December, the wall stood. Not perfectly, not beautifully. It looked like what it was, 320 feet of dead Russian thistle packed between cottonwood stakes and railroad ties, lashed with a patchwork of baling wire, telegraph wire, and twisted salvage, standing 6 feet high in most places, 5 in others, with intentional fire break gaps every 20 feet, and a dogleg entry on the south side wide enough for Halvor to pass through sideways with an armload of fuel. It looked like a joke. It looked like the visual punchline of every dismissal Royston and the men at Pritchard's store had delivered. A ring of weeds around a sod-roofed cabin on the open Kansas prairie, built by a widower with no money, no timber, and no support from anyone except a sick railroad man and a 9-year-old girl with tally marks on a fence post. Marit scratched the final count. 547. January arrived with deceptive calm. The sky opened a pale blue. The wind dropped to 10 miles an hour, then 5. The temperature held at 20 degrees. Cold, but not killing cold. Not yet. Halvor used the calm to test. He hung strips of torn cloth at 3 points. One on the windward stake outside the north wall, one between the wall and the cabin, one inside the cabin door. When a gust came, the outside cloth snapped straight and held. The cloth between the wall and cabin twitched, fluttered, and relaxed. The cloth inside the cabin hung still. The stove flame, visible through the cracked door, held steady for the first time since Halvor had moved in. He measured snow. A 2-inch fall left 8 inches banked against the outer face of the tumbleweed wall and less than an inch on the ground inside the enclosure. The math was simple. The wall was catching snow that would otherwise have driven against the cabin and through the gaps. The snow was building a secondary barrier on the windward side, packing into the weeds, filling the gaps, creating an armor of frozen white that made the wall denser and stronger with every storm. He told Markham. Markham rode over, looked at the cloth strips, looked at the snow measurements, and said, "Small weather proves nothing." He was right. A 2-inch snow and a 10-mile wind was not a test. It was a rehearsal. The real performance would come when the wind hit 40 or 50 or 60 miles an hour, and the temperature dropped below zero, and the snow came not as flakes, but as hard pellets driven horizontal. The kind of snow that found every crack, every gap, every weakness in every structure on the plains and exploited them with the patience of something that had been doing this work since before any cabin existed. Matilda visited. She walked the enclosure with Halvor and admitted the yard was calmer. "But a big drift will pack your children inside," she said. "If the snow builds to the roof on the north side, you cannot get out." "The south dogleg stays clear," Halvor said. "The wind comes from the north and northwest. The south entry is in the lee." "And if the wind shifts?" He showed her the roof hatch, a 2-foot square cut through the sod roof and covered with a board weighted by a stone. A rope ran from the board to a ceiling peg inside the cabin. "If the door's blocked and the dogleg is packed, we go up," he said. She looked at the hatch. She looked at the rope. She looked at Halvor. "You have thought about being buried," she said. "I have thought about everything that can go wrong," he said. "I have not been able to prevent everything that can go wrong, but I have thought about it." Royston came too, uninvited. He rode the perimeter without dismounting and said 2 sentences to Ned Pritchard at the store the next day. "Brecca has built a coffin out of weeds. February will nail it shut." Orrin gave the final warning on the last day of January. They walked the perimeter in lantern light, checking every section the way they had the first night, holding the flame behind the weeds and looking for sections that had grown too dense from packed snow. 3 corners needed their dead man braces retightened. 2 sections had sagged where ice melt had weakened the wire. They fixed what they could. Then Orrin straightened from a corner brace and the cough took him. Not a normal cough. A cough that bent him double, that lasted 30 seconds, that left blood on his lip and a sound in his chest like paper tearing. Halvor reached for him and Orrin held up a hand. "Wait," and breathed in shallow pulls until the coughing passed. "Get inside," Halvor said. "The south entry is too narrow," Orrin said. "If you need to pull someone through it in a storm, a man, a child, you need another 2 feet of clearance. Cut it wider." "Orrin, get inside." "Cut it wider first." They cut it wider. Halvor used the last railroad spike as a chisel and hammered stakes apart until the south dogleg was 4 feet wide instead of 2. Orrin supervised from a sitting position on an overturned bucket, his breathing audible 10 feet away, his eyes tracking every stake removal with the precision of a man who had spent 14 years building things that had to stand against weather that did not forgive mistakes. They went inside. Orrin sat close to the stove and Marit brought him water, and Tolif climbed into his lap without being invited. The old man held the boy with one arm and coughed into his elbow with the other, and the sound of the cough and the sound of the child's breathing mixed together in the warm air above the stove like 2 broken instruments trying to find the same key. News came through a freighter who stopped for water. Arctic air was moving south. The telegraph office in Tribune had posted a warning. Temperatures in Montana had dropped to 30 below. The cold was coming down the plains like a wall, pushed by winds that had nothing between the Arctic and Kansas to slow them down except 1,000 miles of flat grass and whatever anyone had built on it. The 1899 Great Arctic Outbreak. It did not have a name yet. It would not have a name until it was over and the damage could be counted. But it was coming, and the freighter said men who had survived every winter for 20 years were boarding up windows and driving livestock into any structure with a roof. Halvor checked the wall one more time after the freighter left. He walked the full perimeter with the lantern. He checked every dead man anchor, every wire splice, every fire break gap, every section of packing. He counted the cloth strips. He tested the roof hatch rope. He checked the stovepipe for ice. He stacked 3 days of fuel inside the cabin, cottonwood and dried cattle chips, and 3 bundles of compressed tumbleweed waste that burned fast but hot. He stood in the dooryard and looked north. The sky was clear. The stars were bright. The wind was calm. That was the wrong sign. On the plains, calm before a norther did not mean safety. It meant the air was holding its breath. If you have stayed with this story, stay a little longer, because the next hours inside that tumbleweed ring will answer every question this fence has raised, and the answer will come at a cost no one predicted. The storm came on the 4th of February, 1899, and it came wrong. It did not begin with wind. It began with warmth. The morning temperature was 38 degrees. Absurd, impossible warmth for February in western Kansas. The chickens scratched outside the enclosure. Tolliff sat on the south doorstep without his coat. The air smelled wet, like spring, like a lie told in a language the body wants to believe. Markham rode past at noon and did not stop. He looked at the sky and said one sentence as he passed. That color is not right. The sky was greenish yellow along the northern horizon, the color of a bruise that has not yet finished forming. Halvor had seen that color once before, on the railroad near Cheyenne, and the men who knew Wyoming had started lashing everything down an hour before the wind arrived. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 12 degrees. By 3, it was below 20 and falling fast. The wind swung north in a single violent shift, like a door slamming, and the first gust hit the tumbleweed wall at what Halvor guessed was 50 miles an hour. The wall screamed, not a metaphor, not a poetic description. The wind hitting 547 tumbleweeds packed in 320 feet of staked, wired, anchored rows produced a sound unlike anything Halvor had heard in his life. It was a vibration that ran through the dried stems and thorned crowns and salvage wire and telegraph lashings and translated the wind's force into a single sustained note that was part whistle, part moan, part roar. The note rose as the gust strengthened and fell as it paused and rose again, and it filled the enclosure with a sound that made Marit press her hands over Tollef's ears and look at her father with eyes that asked the question she would not speak aloud. Is it holding? Halvor went to the north wall. He pressed his hand against the inner face of the packed weeds and felt them shuddering. The wind was hitting the outer face at speed and passing through in fragments the way Orrin had described, not a solid push, but 1,000 small pushes that arrived from different angles and at different strengths. The wall was flexing. The stakes were creaking. The wire was singing, but it was not breaking. The fragments of wind that came through the lee side arrived without force, falling against his hand the way breath falls against skin, cold but gentle. He checked the cloth strips. The outside strip was gone, ripped away in the first gust. The strip between the wall and the cabin was fluttering but not snapping. The strip inside the cabin door hung motionless. The fence was working. The first hour passed in a state of controlled terror. Every gust brought a new sound, a crack from a stake, a twang from a wire, a hiss as snow hit the windward face and packed into the weeds. Halvor moved between the wall and the cabin in a circuit, checking stakes, checking wire, checking corners. Orrin sat inside by the stove with the children because his lungs could not take the outside air, but he had given Halvor a length of rope tied to the south entry post, and Halvor kept it looped around his wrist so that if the wind took him off his feet, he could pull himself back. The snow came at 4 o'clock, not flakes, pellets, hard, dry, driven horizontal by a wind that had picked up everything between here and Nebraska and was delivering it at 60 miles an hour. The pellets hit the tumbleweed wall and disappeared into the packed stems. On the windward side, a white crust began to form. The weeds vanished beneath it. The wall became a snow wall with a skeleton of dead plants inside it, and the snow made it heavier, denser, and stronger. Halvor watched the transformation with something between wonder and dread. The wall was becoming what Oren had described, a snow fence that captured its own armor. Each hour of storm added inches of packed snow to the windward face, and each inch of packed snow reduced the porosity of the weeds, which changed the way the wind behaved. Where the wall had been breathing, passing wind through in fragments, it was now choking, and the choking meant more pressure on the stakes and anchors. He checked the northeast corner. The dead man brace was holding. The wire hummed at a pitch that vibrated in his teeth. He grabbed the corner stake and pulled. Solid. The buried railroad tie and the 3 feet of frozen earth above it were doing what Oren had promised, translating the wind's lateral force into downward pull that the ground could absorb. Inside the cabin, the stove held. That was the thing Halvor had not fully believed until he saw it. The stove held because the air inside the enclosure was calm enough for the chimney draft to work properly. In every previous wind, the draft had been erratic. Gusts pushed smoke back down the pipe, embers scattered, the fire choked and flared unpredictably. Now the pipe drew clean and steady, and the heat built and held, and the cabin temperature climbed to a level that did not require Marit and Tolef to sleep in their coats. Then Tolef's cough worsened. The boy had been coughing since spring, the wet rattle that never fully cleared, and the stress of the storm, the noise, the cold air that leaked through the cabin gaps before the wind died in the enclosure, pushed his lungs past what they could manage. At 6 o'clock, he began coughing in spasms that left him red-faced and gasping, and Oren held him upright because lying down made it worse, and Marit heated water on the stove and held the steam cup under her brother's face while the wind screamed outside and the wall shuddered, and Halvor stood in the doorway trying to be in 2 places at once. He could not leave the cabin to check the wall. He could not ignore the wall to stay with Tolef. The storm was pulling him apart, the way storms pull apart everything that is not anchored, and the anchoring that mattered most, the certainty that his choices were right, was exactly the thing he did not have. At 8 o'clock, the stovepipe clogged. Rim ice. The moisture in the smoke condensed at the pipe's exit and froze in a ring that narrowed the opening, and the ring grew inward until the draft choked and smoke began filling the cabin. Halvor saw it first, the smoke curling back from the pipe joint, pooling on the ceiling, dropping toward the children. He opened the south dogleg entry for ventilation, and the cold air hit the cabin like a slap. Tolef screamed, not from pain, but from the sudden, brutal cold on lungs that were already failing. He had to clear the pipe. The pipe exited through the sod roof. The only way to reach the exit from outside was to climb the roof. In a storm with 60-mile winds and near zero visibility and temperature falling below zero, Oren said, "Use the hatch." The roof hatch. The 2-foot square cut through the sod, covered with a board weighted by a stone. Halvor pulled the rope. The board lifted. Wind and snow poured through the opening like water through a broken dam, cold, white, howling. But the wind was the enclosure wind, not the prairie wind. The tumbleweed wall had taken the prairie's 60-mile gust and delivered it to the roof hatch as a 15-mile turbulence, strong enough to numb his face in seconds, not strong enough to throw him. He climbed through with a rope around his waist and a wagon pin in his fist. The roof was a nightmare of ice-crusted sod and driven snow, and the wind changed direction every 3 seconds as the eddies inside the enclosure swirled. He could see the tumbleweed wall as a white ridge to the north and west, glowing faintly in the snowlight, higher than it had been 3 hours ago. 10 feet of packed snow on the windward side. The wall was becoming a fortress. He found the pipe. The ice ring was 2 inches thick, narrowing the 4-inch opening to a slot the width of his thumb. He hammered it with the wagon pin, and the ice shattered and fell in pieces that the wind snatched away. Smoke roared from the cleared pipe, and the wind took that too. He jammed a rag into the gap between the pipe and the sod to seal the leak he had always known was there, and he went back through the hatch, and Marit closed the board, and the stove drew clean, and the smoke cleared, and Tollef stopped screaming and started coughing again, which was better. The night deepened. The temperature dropped below zero. Orrin estimated the wind at 70 miles an hour based on the sound. He had spent 14 years calibrating his ears to wind speed the way a musician calibrates to pitch, and he said the note the wall was making was a note he had heard only twice before, both times in Wyoming during storms that derailed freight cars. Halvor did not sleep. He sat by the south entry with the rope around his wrist and listened to the wall. The sound changed as the snow packed deeper. The screaming dropped to a groan, then to a low hum, then to something that was almost silence, because the snow had sealed the porosity, and the wind was now hitting what amounted to a 10-foot frozen embankment that did not move. At 11 o'clock, someone pounded on the south entry. Halvor heard it through the snow, and the wind and the wall's hum, a rhythmic banging, fist on wood, desperate and weakening. He opened the dogleg entry into a whiteout that extended 3 feet before becoming opaque. A shape fell inward. A man. Face crusted white. Hands clawed. Breathing in gasps that rattled worse than Tollef's. Jace Morley. Del Royston's hired hand. 26 years old, thin, with a cattleman's leather chaps frozen stiff to his legs and a cut across his forehead where something, a fence post, a branch, flying debris, had opened the skin. He had been driving cattle toward a draw when the storm hit and the cattle scattered, and his horse stumbled into a snowdrift and threw him and disappeared. He crawled. He did not know which direction he crawled. He crawled until he hit something solid, the south drift of Halvor's tumbleweed wall, and he followed the solid thing because solid things meant someone had built them, and someone who built things was someone who might be alive. He followed the wall to the entry because the entry was the only break in the solid thing, and he pounded on the stakes because he could not stand. Halvor pulled him inside. Orrin and Marit stripped his frozen chaps and his boots. Matilda's willow switches were burning in the stove. Halvor had added them for extra heat, and the cabin was warm enough for Morley's hands to begin thawing, which was when the pain started. He screamed into his elbow while Orrin held his hands over the stove's radiating heat and talked him through it the way a man talks a horse through shoeing, steady, low, relentless. "You're in Brekka's place," Orrin said. "The tumbleweed man. You're inside his garbage fence. It's the only thing standing between you and freezing in a ditch." "Breathe." Morley breathed. He looked at the walls of the cabin, at the stove, at the children, at the tumbleweed visible through the south entry where the lantern light caught the packed stems. He looked at Halvor, who was standing in the entry with the snow on his shoulders and the rope still around his wrist. "The fence," Morley said. "That's the fence they laughed at." "That is the fence," Halvor said. Outside, the wind howled across the open prairie at 70 miles an hour, and the temperature sat at 15 below zero, and the snow drove horizontal across a landscape that offered nothing. No timber break, no sod bank, no hay wall, no shelter of any kind except a ring of dead Russian thistle packed between cottonwood stakes and railroad ties, and held together with baling wire, telegraph wire, and the calculations of a man who had studied the wind until the wind's own habits became weapons against it. Inside the ring, the air was still. The stove burned, the children slept. The hired man wept into his thawing hands, and the wall held. By morning, the wind dropped to 30 miles an hour, and the temperature climbed to 5 below, and the sky opened to the pale, exhausted blue that follows a norther. The way silence follows a gunshot. Halvor opened the south entry and stepped outside. The world had changed. The tumbleweed fence had become a snow fortress. On the windward side, the drift reached 10 feet. A smooth, curved wall of packed white that ran the entire north face and wrapped around the corners. The weeds were invisible beneath it, entombed in snow that had been delivered by the storm and deposited by the barrier exactly where Orin said it would fall. The drift tapered to 2 feet near the cabin, and at the cabin door the snow was shallow enough to push open without effort. Halvor pulled Orin's measuring pole from inside the enclosure. He walked the perimeter and pushed the pole into the snow at each corner and midpoint. 10 feet at the north face, 8 feet at the northeast corner, 6 feet at the east wall where the drift curved away from the wind, 2 feet inside the enclosure, 18 inches at the south entry. The mathematics of wind and porosity and placement had been written in snow. Every calculation Halvor and Orin had made, the distance from the cabin, the height of the wall, the packing density, the anchor bracing, the dogleg entry, every one of them was now visible as a physical fact pressed into the landscape. The wind had tested every decision, and the decisions had held. Marit opened the cabin door. No snow fell into the room. She stepped outside and looked at the white wall to the north, and the clear yard around the cabin, and the smoke rising straight from the stovepipe in the still air. She looked at her father. "The tally marks," she said. 547. 547, Halvor said. She nodded. Then she went inside to heat water for Jace Morley's hands. The news traveled faster than the thaw. Markham came first, as the outline promised, because Alpheus Markham was a man who needed to see proof before he could allow himself to believe it, and because what he had seen from a distance, the white ridge of Halvor's drift wall standing above the flat, scoured prairie like something deliberate, contradicted everything he had survived long enough to know. He rode the bay gelding through snow that reached the horse's chest in the open flats, and dropped to ankle depth inside Halvor's enclosure. And the difference between those two measurements was the argument he had come to have with himself. He dismounted at the south entry and walked the perimeter the way he had walked the cabin wall in October, pressing, testing, examining. But this time, the thing he was examining was not a failing structure. It was a succeeding one. The windward drift stood 10 feet high, smooth and curved and dense, tapering to a thin crust inside the yard. The cabin walls were dry. The sod roof was intact. The stovepipe drew clean smoke into air that moved slowly and without direction inside the enclosure. Markham stood at the north face and looked at the drift. He pushed his cane into it. The cane went in 8 inches before hitting packed tumbleweed stem. He pulled it out. He looked at the hole. He pushed the cane in at a different angle. Same result. The snow and the weeds had merged into a composite material, not pure ice, not pure brush, but a frozen matrix that was stronger than either component alone. He walked to the cabin. Halvor was inside, feeding the stove. Tollef was sleeping. Marit was heating water. Jace Morley was sitting on the floor, with his hands wrapped in strips of flour sacking, flexing his fingers and wincing. "Morley," Markham said, "you are here." "I crawled here in the storm," Morley said. "Hit the south wall, followed it to the entry." Markham looked at Halvor. Halvor looked back. Neither man spoke for a moment that stretched long enough to hold the weight of everything Markham had said in October, the verdict about the stovepipe, the thin roof, the north wind walking through like a hired man. The prediction that Halvor could not survive without timber, sod, hay, or neighbors with all three. The offer to take the children. I told you wind does not stumble, Markham said. I was wrong. You made it break its stride. He did not say it warmly. He did not say it with the relief of a man who had been hoping to be proven wrong. He said it with the flat precision of a man correcting an error in his own ledger, an entry that had been wrong and needed to be right, because Alpheus Markham had survived 61 years on the plains by keeping his ledger accurate, and inaccuracy, even his own, was something he could not tolerate. How? He said. It was not a question. It was a demand. Halvor showed him. They walked the perimeter together, and Halvor explained through the evidence. The porosity principle demonstrated by the cloth strips, the snow placement demonstrated by the drift measurements, the anchor system demonstrated by the corners that had held in 70-mile wind. He did not lecture. He pointed. He showed. He let Markham pull on the dead man braces and feel the wire hum and push his cane through the drift and see the tumbleweed skeleton inside the snow armor. Markham listened the way he did everything, with total attention and no unnecessary response. When they finished, he stood at the south entry and looked at the enclosure as a whole, and what he saw was not a garbage fence. What he saw was a system. Stakes, weeds, wire, spacing, anchors, fire breaks, entry angles, drift placement, each element connected to every other, each one doing a specific job that made the others possible. It was not a wall. It was an argument made of dead plants, and the argument had won. My hay brake lost 2 calves last night, Markham said. The drift went through the fence line, and the calves could not find shelter. If I had placed a catch line 30 feet out, the drift would have built there instead of at the shed. Yes, Halvor said. Show me how to place a catch line. Matilda came next. She did not come to see the fence. She came to see Halvor, because Matilda Crowell had spent the storm with her face pressed against her own cabin window, watching the white ridge of Halvor's drift wall from half a mile away and thinking about what it meant that the thing she had called tinder was now the only structure visible in a landscape that had erased everything else. Her boys had survived. They had followed a rope from house to barn and back. The rope coated in ice so thick their gloves froze to it. Their roof had leaked powder snow through the shingle gaps, and the north corner of their cabin had a white wedge of packed snow inside the room that reached the bottom of the window frame. Their stove had gone out twice when Gus backed down the pipe. They had eaten cold biscuits and wrapped themselves in everything they owned and waited. She walked Halvor's enclosure in silence. She touched the inner face of the tumbleweed wall where the weeds were visible beneath a thin frost. She looked at the fire break gaps, the 1-foot breaks in the packing that she had suggested after the east wall fire. She looked at the dogleg entry, widened to 4 feet on Orrin's insistence. She looked at the roof hatch. Your yard is dry, she said. The wall catches the snow before it reaches the cabin, Halvor said. My roof leaked all night. My boys could not keep the stove lit. She paused. You were right about the wind. I was right about the fire. Between us, we might build something that neither kills nor burns. It was the closest Matilda Crowell came to admitting she had been wrong, and it was enough because what she was actually saying was not, I was wrong, but I want to learn. And the difference between those two statements was the difference between defeat and partnership. Bring your boys next week, Halvor said. I will show them the lantern test. The community came in 1s and 2s over the following weeks, as the cold held and the snow stayed and the evidence of Halvor's fence became impossible to ignore. A man named Lofgren, whose sod house had lost its north wall in the storm, came to ask how deep the stakes needed to be. A woman named Bascom, whose husband had lost 3 fingers to frostbite clearing snow from their door, came to ask about the dogleg entry. A family named Ott, who had spent the storm in their root cellar because the cabin above was unlivable, came to ask about everything. Halvor did not hoard the method. He laid out practical rules the way Orin had taught him, through action, through demonstration, through the evidence of things that could be seen and touched and tested. Scrape a fire break 12 feet wide between the wall and any structure. Bare earth, nothing that can carry flame. Do not pack the weeds solid. Hold a lantern behind the wall at dusk. If the light disappears, loosen the packing. If the light pours through unchanged, add weeds. The goal is scattered glow, half light, half barrier. Brace every corner and every midpoint with a dead man anchor. Bury a cross pole 3 feet deep and 4 feet back. Run a diagonal wire from the stake to the buried pole. Twist until the wire sings when you pluck it. Keep the entry on the lee side, south or southeast in Kansas, where the dangerous wind comes from the north and northwest. Build it as a dogleg, not a straight gap, so the wind cannot find a clear path. Build intentional fire break gaps every 20 feet, 1 foot wide, no weeds, no wire. A fire that reaches the gap stops at the gap. Never let the stove throw sparks toward the wall. Wire mesh over the pipe exit. Ash barrel downwind, 40 paces minimum. Measure with cloth strips before trusting your eye. Hang a strip outside the wall, between the wall and the cabin, and inside the door. When all 3 strips agree that the wind is managed, the wall is working. Place the wall far enough from the cabin that the lee drift will not reach the door. 25 feet minimum. 30 is better. The drift builds from the wall, not from the cabin. If you build too close, the wall buries you instead of protecting you. Orin sat by the stove during these teaching sessions and corrected Halvor once, quietly. Halvor had told Lofgren to set his stakes 4 feet apart along the line. Orin said 3.5 was stronger in loose soil. Halvor looked at him, and Orin shrugged, and the correction was absorbed without argument. Teacher and student had become collaborators, and the collaboration worked because both men understood that the knowledge belonged to neither of them. It belonged to the wind. Royston did not come. Royston sent a message through Ned Pritchard. The fence had trapped weed seed across a 1/4 mile of leased grass, and Royston intended to file a complaint with the county about invasive plants spreading from Halvor's property. The complaint was technically plausible. Russian thistle produced thousands of seeds per plant, and 547 plants packed in a concentrated area would scatter seed generously when the snow melted. The complaint was also exactly the kind of action a man takes when the thing he predicted would fail has succeeded, and he needs a new angle of attack. Halvor did not respond to the message. He had no time for Royston's grievances. He had Tollef's cough to manage, and Orin's lungs to worry about, and 12 feet of east wall to rebuild where the December fire had weakened the structure, and the cold was holding at 10 below during the day and 25 below at night. And every hour of daylight was an hour of maintenance, repair, and fuel management that could not be spent on a man whose only interest was acquisition. But Royston's message contained a threat that Halvor could not ignore. If Russian thistle seed spread from his enclosure to neighboring claims, the neighbors who were now asking for help would become neighbors with grievance. The innovation that had saved his family could become the thing that turned the community against him. Halvor needed to manage the seed problem, and he needed to do it before spring melt released 547 plants worth of seeds into the wind. He filed this problem for later. The immediate winter had not finished with him yet. The second week of February brought a warming trend that softened the outer drift, and then a sharp refreeze that turned the softened snow to ice. The ice shell made the windward face of the fence nearly impervious to wind, which was good for protection but terrible for the stakes underneath. The ice was heavy. Where the drift had been snow, light, porous, self-supporting, It was now a solid mass pressing inward on the stake rows with a weight that the original design had not anticipated. Two midpoint stakes cracked. A section of wire stretched until the sag allowed weeds to shift and the packing loosened. Halvor repaired in bitter cold, chipping ice with the wagon pin to reach the damaged stakes, splicing new wire with numb fingers, repacking weeds into gaps that the ice had opened. Orrin could not help. His cough had become a constant, and the cold air turned each breath into a negotiation between his will and his lungs that his will was slowly losing. But Orrin watched. He sat at the south entry, bundled in every piece of cloth the cabin contained, and watched Halvor work. And when Halvor made a mistake, setting a splice too close to a stress point, pegging a gap too tight, Orrin's voice carried across the yard with corrections that were spare and exact. Left hand, higher. The splice carries load below the knot, not above. His voice was losing volume but not precision. The knowledge was intact even as the vessel weakened. In the third week of February, the cold broke. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in 26 days. Water ran from the drift face in streams that carved channels through the packed snow and pooled in the yard. The tumbleweed wall emerged from its snow armor like bones from melting flesh, still standing, still staked, still wired, but visibly weathered. Stems had cracked, crowns had compressed, whole sections had been crushed flat by the snow's weight and would need to be rebuilt before next winter. But the cabin was standing. The children were alive. The mare was alive in her lean-to, thin but breathing. And Halvor Breka had survived the worst winter storm in a decade with $11 worth of supplies, 547 tumbleweeds, and the knowledge that wind could be spent if you understood how it wanted to move. Orrin Voss gave his final gift on a mild afternoon in early March. They were sitting outside the south entry in weak sunlight, the first sunlight warm enough to feel on skin in nearly 2 months. Tullif was playing in the mud near the lean-to, his cough diminished now that the air was warmer. Marit was inside, organizing the food stores, which were low but not empty. The yard smelled of wet earth and thawing tumbleweed, and the particular mineral scent of snow becoming water. Orrin reached into his coat and produced a watch. It was a railroad watch, heavy, brass, with a cracked crystal, and a chain that had been repaired 3 times with different kinds of wire. The back was engraved with initials that were not Orrin's. "I carried this since '79, Orrin said. "A section boss named Pollard gave it to me when he retired. He said a man who works with weather needs to know what time it is because weather does not care what time it is, and that is the advantage." He held it out to Halvor. Halvor did not take it. "Orrin," he said. "Measure what moves," Orrin said. "Wind, snow, time. Men fear what they do not measure. You measured the wind, and it stopped being a monster. It became a problem. Problems have solutions. Monsters do not." Halvor took the watch. The brass was warm from Orrin's pocket. The crystal was cracked, but the hands moved. The time was wrong by an hour, but the time did not matter. What mattered was the weight of the thing in his palm and the weight of what it represented. 14 years of snow fence work and 30 years of railroad labor and a lifetime of watching weather and learning its habits distilled into a single object passed from one pair of hands to another. "I will not be here for next winter," Orrin said. He said it without drama. He said it the way he said everything, as a fact observed, assessed, and reported. His lungs were failing. The cold had accelerated what the coal smoke had started years ago. He could feel the reduction in his breath the way a man feels a rope fraying, strand by strand, each one smaller than the last, until the thing that held him to the work could no longer hold. You know everything I know, Orrin said. You know most of what I know better than I know it, because you learned it by building, and building teaches what talking cannot. The only thing I have left to give you is this. He tapped the watch. Time. Measure it. Use it. Do not waste it arguing with men like Royston. Build. Halvor held the watch and said nothing. The spring sun was thin but real, and the mud was soft, and the tumbleweed walls stood ragged and weathered behind them, like the skeleton of something that had done its job and was waiting to learn whether it would be needed again. Orrin left in the second week of March. He walked southeast toward a cousin's place near Dodge City, moving slowly, stopping to cough every 100 yards, his bedroll on his back, and his walking stick tapping a rhythm that grew slower as the distance grew longer. Halvor watched until the figure disappeared into the brown grass, and then he stood in the yard for a while with the watch in his pocket and the ticking against his thigh, and the silence where Orrin's cough had been was a different kind of silence than the silence the wind left when it stopped. Some things are quieter for having once been full of sound. Orrin died on the 19th of April. Halvor received the letter from the cousin 3 weeks later. The letter said Orrin had been comfortable. The letter said Orrin had talked about snow fences in his last days, drawing diagrams on the bed sheet with his finger, explaining porosity ratios to a cousin who did not understand what porosity meant, but who sat and listened because the dying man needed to teach and the living man needed to witness it. Halvor read the letter at the table while Marit watched, and Tollef played on the floor with a spool of wire. He folded the letter and put it in the flour tin with the deed paper and went outside and walked the perimeter of the enclosure, checking every stake, every wire, every corner brace, the way Orrin had taught him to check. With his hands, with his eyes, with the measured attention of a man who understands that the things we build outlast the people who teach us how to build them. He did not cry. He stood at the northeast corner, where the dead man anchor held a wire that still hummed when he plucked it, and he plucked it, and the note it made was the same note it had made in December, when Orrin had said, "Pull it," and the stake had not moved. The note had not changed. The man who tuned it was gone. The note remained. The secondary crisis came in October of 1899, earlier than anyone expected. An ice storm swept Greeley County on the 12th of October, 6 weeks before the usual start of sustained winter weather. The storm laid a half-inch of ice on everything: grass, fence wire, sod roofs, wagon wheels, the hides of cattle standing in the open. Then the temperature dropped and the ice became permanent, and the families who had not yet finished their winter preparations were suddenly exposed. 3 families had begun building tumbleweed catch fences based on Halvor's teaching. Only one, Matilda Crowell's cow, was finished. The Lofgren place had stakes, but no weeds packed. The Ott place had weeds, but no anchors. Both families were now facing a winter that had started 6 weeks early, with structures that were incomplete and useless, and Royston had made it worse. During September, Royston had sold what he called break-a-weed screens to 4 families on the eastern edge of the county. He charged $3 apiece for bundles of tumbleweeds wired between 2-foot stakes. No fire break, no dead man anchors, no porosity testing, no entry design. They were walls, not fences. Solid packed weeds on short stakes with no engineering behind them. Royston had taken Halvor's principle, stripped out everything that made it work, and sold the carcass at a profit. On the night of the ice storm, one of Royston's screens caught fire at the Morley place, Jace Morley's own homestead. An ember from the stovepipe, carried by a gust that the too solid weed wall could not disrupt, landed on the packed weeds and ignited them. The screen burned in 90 seconds. The fire jumped to a hay pile near the barn. Jace Morley's wife woke to smoke and pulled their infant through the back window while Jace beat the hay fire with blankets. Nobody died. The barn survived because the hay pile was only half stacked and the ice storm's moisture dampened the fire's spread. But the Morley cabin's south wall was scorched black, and the weed screen was ash, and the story that spread through the county was not Royston sold a bad product. The story that spread was Breca's fence method nearly killed the Morley baby. Halvor heard the story from Matilda, who heard it from Garrett, who heard it at the store. The distortion was complete by the time it reached Halvor. He had taught the method, Royston had sold the method, and the method had failed. No one distinguished between a properly built catch fence with fire breaks and porosity testing and a solid packed weed wall on 2-foot stakes with no engineering at all. The failure carried Halvor's name because Halvor was the man who had built the first one, and in a community where news traveled by repetition, the first version of a story was the one that stuck. Halvor rode to the Morley place the same day he heard. He found Jace clearing ash from the scorched wall. The weed screen, what was left of it, lay in a blackened tangle of wire and charred stems. Halvor knelt beside it and examined the remains. 2-foot stakes, no buried anchors, no fire break. The weeds had been packed solid. He could see it in the way the wire had compressed the stems into a uniform mat with no gaps. This was not his method. This was not even a reasonable imitation of his method. This was a man selling lumber by the name of Carpentry. Who built this? Halvor asked, though he already knew. Royston sold it to me, Morley said. $3. He said it was the same thing you built. It is not the same thing. My wife does not care about the difference. My daughter was inside. Halvor looked at the scorched cabin wall. He looked at the place where the hay pile had burned. He looked at the infant sleeping in a basket by the open door, breathing the smoke-tainted air with the unconcerned rhythm of a creature that did not yet understand what fire meant. I will build you a proper one, Halvor said. No charge. But you must help me build it, and you must learn why each piece matters, because the next man who offers you a cheap version will be selling you the same lie. They built it in 4 days. Halvor taught Morley the same way Oren had taught him, through action. Drive the stakes deep. Bury the anchors. Pack the weeds loose enough for the lantern test. Cut the fire break. Build the dog leg. Test with cloth strips. Morley's hands were blistered by the 2nd day, and his back ached by the 3rd, and on the 4th he stood inside his new enclosure and felt the wind drop against his face and understood, not because Halvor had told him, but because his body had learned it through labor, why the spacing mattered, and the fire break mattered, and the porosity mattered. Royston did not build this, Morley said, looking at his own completed fence with the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something real with his own blistered hands. Royston built a pile, Halvor said. A pile is not a fence. Halvor organized the bucket line for the Lofgren place next. He and Markham, who had once said wind does not stumble, spent 3 days helping Lofgren finish his catch fence before the next cold snap. Markham drove stakes while Halvor packed weeds, and they did not talk about the October conversation at the cabin, or the January storm, or the calves that Markham had lost. They talked about stake depth and wire tension, and how far back the catch line needed to sit, because the work was the conversation, and the conversation was the only apology either man needed. If this story has shown you that preparation is not about having the most, but about understanding the most, share it with someone who is building something the world does not understand yet. The Ott family took another 2 days. Their claim was farther north, exposed to a wind corridor that ran between 2 low rises, and the fence design needed to be adjusted, angled to catch the channeled flow instead of the broad north wind. Halvor made the adjustment by feel and by cloth strip testing, walking the corridor with scraps of torn shirt held at arm's length until he found the line where the wind was strongest, and then placing the fence 30 feet upwind of the cabin. It was the kind of adaptation that Orrin would have made, the kind that required understanding the principle well enough to bend it without breaking it. By the end of October, 5 families had working catch fences. 4 of them had been built or rebuilt with Halvor's direct involvement. The 5th was Matilda's, which had been built correctly from the beginning because Matilda had listened not just to what Halvor told her, but to what Matilda's own fear of fire had added to the design. Royston's reputation suffered quietly. No one confronted him publicly about the Morley fire. No one filed a complaint. But men stopped buying his weed screens, and Ned Pritchard stopped stocking the wire bundles Royston had been selling at the store, and the phrase Brecca weed screen, which Royston had attached to his product, became the phrase people used when they meant something that looked right but was wrong underneath. Halvor did not gloat. He did not mention Royston. He built fences and taught methods and walked perimeters with families who had once repeated the phrase garbage fence and now wanted to understand why a garbage fence had survived a storm that their timber and sod and hay had not. He taught them the way Orrin had taught him, by doing, by showing, by letting the evidence speak in a language that did not require translation. The watch ticked in his pocket. The time was still wrong by an hour. He did not correct it. The hour did not matter. What mattered was the ticking, the steady mechanical heartbeat of a thing that measured what moved, the way Orrin had said, because what you measure stops being a monster and becomes a problem, and problems have solutions. Winter came. The fences held. The county lost fewer cattle, fewer roofs, fewer fingers than the year before. Nobody credited Halvor publicly, because public credit on the plains was as scarce as timber, but the families who had built catch fences knew, and the families who had not built them noticed, and the difference between knowing and noticing was the distance between survival and intention. Halvor had crossed that distance. He was no longer a man trying to survive. He was a man trying to teach, and teaching brought its own dangers. The danger of the method being corrupted, the danger of the teacher being blamed for the student's failure, the danger of responsibility without authority. But these were problems, not monsters, and problems had solutions. The seed problem arrived with the spring melt, exactly as Royston had predicted. When the snow retreated from the windward drift in late March of 1900, the tumbleweed wall emerged in its full weathered state. Stems cracked, crowns compressed, wire sagging where the ice load had stretched it, and scattered through the drift's meltwater, washing across the yard and into the surrounding grass in a brown slurry, were thousands of Russian thistle seeds. Each of the 547 tumbleweeds Halvor had packed into his fence carried seeds in its branch forks and crown tangles, and the winter's compression had done nothing to kill them. The seeds were viable. They would germinate in any disturbed soil they reached, and the meltwater was carrying them in every direction the slope allowed. Halvor saw the problem on the first warm day when Merritt pointed at the yard's edge, where a line of tiny green shoots was pushing through the mud in a pattern that matched the meltwater channels exactly. Russian thistle seedlings, hundreds of them. A carpet of the plant he had used for salvation becoming a carpet of the plant that ranchers cursed and farmers burned, and county agents warned about and printed bulletins that nobody read until the infestation was in their own field. He could not let the seedlings mature. If 500 plants produced 500 times 1,000 seeds each, his quarter section would become the epicenter of a thistle spread that would reach every neighboring claim within 2 seasons. Royston's complaint would become legitimate. The community that had begun trusting Halvor's method would have a reason to turn against it, and the reason would be growing in their pastures. Halvor spent the first 2 weeks of April pulling seedlings by hand. Marit helped, Tolif helped, though his small fingers could not grip the tiny stems, and he spent more time digging in the mud than weeding. The work was endless. Each rainstorm brought more seeds to the surface. Each warm day germinated more. Halvor's hands cracked and bled from the pulling, and his knees ached from kneeling in wet dirt for hours, and the seedlings kept coming. He needed a better approach. He needed to deal with the source, not the spread. On the 20th of April, he began dismantling the fence. Not all of it. The stakes and wire and anchors stayed, but the tumbleweeds themselves, the 547 packed, weathered, seed-laden plants that had saved his family, came out. He pulled them section by section, piled them in a shallow pit he dug 50 yards downwind of the cabin, and burned them. The burning took 3 days. He wet the grass around the pit with bucket water from the creek. He burned in small batches, watching the wind direction, keeping Marit stationed upwind with a wet sack in case a spark escaped. The smoke was acrid and thick, carrying the particular smell of something that had served its purpose, being returned to the elements that had created it. Each batch of burning weeds released a brief, intense heat that charred the seeds along with the stems, and by the time the last pile was ash, the seed source was eliminated. The fence stood empty, bare stakes and wire in 2 parallel rows around the cabin, like the ribs of something that had lost its skin. Halvor looked at it and felt the loss of 547 tumbleweeds, the way a man feels the loss of any tool that has saved his life. Not sentimental, not grieving, but aware of the absence in a way that changed the shape of the space. He would refill the fence before next winter, but this time he would select cleaner weeds, plants caught early in the season before they set heavy seed, dried and stripped of the worst seed heads before packing. He would also experiment with other materials. Standing sorghum rows planted on the windward side could serve as a living catch, growing each summer and dying back each winter into a natural brush barrier that did not carry the thistle's invasive seed load. Willow cuttings pushed into the moist soil near the creek draw could root and grow into a permanent windbreak over 3 to 5 years. A living fence that improved with time instead of deteriorating. The evolution was not abandonment. It was the principle adapting to its own consequences. Oren had said measure what moves. The seeds moved. Halvor measured the problem and adjusted the design. By summer of 1900, Halvor had become something he had never intended, an authority. Not the kind of authority that Markham represented, earned through decades of survival and delivered through pronouncement. A different kind. The kind that is earned through solving a problem publicly and then being honest about the problem's costs. Families came to the Brecka place not because Halvor had all the answers, but because he had demonstrated the willingness to find them, test them, and discard the ones that did not work. He helped 7 more families build catch fences that summer and autumn. Each one was slightly different. The Lofgren place needed a curved line because the wind channeled between 2 rises. The Bascom place needed a shorter wall because the cabin sat in a natural depression that already provided partial shelter. A new arrival named Chesney needed the fence placed unusually far from his cabin, 40 feet, because his well sat between the house and the natural drift line and burial would contaminate his water. Each adaptation taught Halvor something new about the principle he had stumbled onto beside a fence corner 2 years ago. Wind was not one thing. Wind was 100 things, shaped by terrain, redirected by structures, accelerated through gaps, weakened by friction, loaded with snow in one direction and empty in another. A porous barrier did not behave the same way in a wind corridor as it did on an open flat. A catch fence placed near a rise worked differently than one placed in a draw. The principle was universal: disrupt organized wind into disorganized fragments. But the application was always local, always specific, always dependent on reading the particular landscape where the fence would stand. Markham accompanied him to two of the builds. The old stockman drove stakes and hauled weeds and said very little, but his presence carried a message that words could not. The man who had survived 1886 and who had said Halvor's method was foolishness was now helping build it on other people's claims. The community read Markham's silence the way communities read all silence from respected men, as endorsement, which it was. Markham told new settlers something he had never told anyone before the Blue Norther. Measure your wind before you buy lumber you cannot afford. It was Halvor's principle compressed into Markham's language, practical, frugal, stripped of anything that sounded like philosophy. New families heard it from Markham's mouth and believed it because Markham's mouth was the mouth they trusted, and Halvor did not mind the translation. The principle did not care who delivered it. The principle cared only that someone did. Matilda Crowell became Halvor's working partner in the autumn of 1900, and the partnership began with an argument. She arrived at the Brecky place on a September morning with a wagon load of willow cuttings she had harvested from the creek draw, 200 slender rods, each one 3 to 4 feet long, freshly cut and wrapped in wet burlap to keep the ends moist. She had not asked Halvor whether he wanted them. She had decided he needed them, and she had cut them, and she had hauled them, and she was unloading them before he came out of the cabin. "What is this?" Halvor said. "Willow starts," Matilda said, "for your north line. Push them into the wet ground along the outer stake row. By spring they root. By next winter they have branches. In 3 years you have a living fence that does not need to be packed every autumn." "I know what willow starts are," Halvor said. "I was planning to plant them along the northwest face, not the north." "The northwest face gets less meltwater. The cuttings will not root as well. The north line has the deepest drift melt, which means the wettest soil in spring, which means the strongest root establishment. You plant the north line first and the northwest line second." Halvor looked at the willow cuttings. He looked at Matilda. She was standing with her hands on her hips and mud on her boots, and the absolute certainty of a woman who had farmed alone for 4 years and who knew wet soil the way Halvor knew wind, not from books or teaching, but from kneeling in it every spring and watching what grew and what did not. "The north line is too close to the drift deposit," Halvor said. "The weight of the snow will crush young willow in the first winter." "Not if you put them outside the stake row, not between the rows. Outside the drift, in the runoff zone. The snow protects them from wind. The melt feeds them in spring. The drift does not reach them because they are on the windward side of the windward row." She was right. Halvor knew she was right because he could see the placement in his mind and the physics of it held. The willow cuttings standing in the zone where the heaviest snow fell, insulated by the drift, fed by the melt, growing roots into soil that stayed wet longest. It was the kind of observation that came from someone who paid attention to water the way Halvor paid attention to air, and the two forms of attention were complementary in a way that neither could be alone. "Fine," he said. "The north line first." "And you're going to help me plant my west line next week," she said. "I want a living fence for the barn approach. The boys are old enough to maintain it, but I need help placing it." "Your west approach has a shallow water table," Halvor said. "Willow will root fast there." "I know. That is why I chose it." They planted Halvor's north line that day and Matilda's west line the following week. The work was muddy, slow, and precise. Each cutting pushed into the soil at a 45-degree angle, spaced 18 inches apart, the cut end down and the butt end up. Halvor's hands were better at driving stakes. Matilda's hands were better at reading soil. She could push a cutting in and tell from the resistance whether the ground beneath was clay or sand or gravel, and she adjusted the angle accordingly. They argued about the spacing on Matilda's barn line. Halvor said 12 inches. Matilda said 24. They compromised at 18. They argued about whether the line should curve to follow the natural drainage or run straight for easier maintenance. They compromised, straight for the first 40 feet, then curving to match the draw. They argued about whether to add a sorghum row behind the willow as a secondary catch, and on this they did not compromise. Matilda said yes, and Halvor said not yet, and Matilda planted the sorghum anyway, and Halvor looked at the sorghum row 2 months later when the stalks were standing and admitted that the combination of willow and sorghum caught more snow than either one alone. The courtship was conducted entirely through labor. There were no flowers, no formal calls, no Sunday walks. There was a man and a woman doing hard work on each other's claims and arguing about the work and respecting the arguments and returning the next day to do more. There was Matilda correcting Halvor's planting angle and Halvor adjusting Matilda's wire tension, and Marit watching both of them with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is happening between two adults and who approves of it because the something important involves willow cuttings and not the kind of adult nonsense that wastes time. Garrett and his younger brother accepted Halvor before Halvor knew he was being evaluated. Garrett started showing up at the break-up place on mornings when there was fence work to do, and he worked alongside Halvor without conversation, and the quality of his work improved until Halvor trusted him to pack weeds and test porosity with the lantern without supervision. The younger boy, Thomas, attached himself to Tollef, and the two of them built miniature tumbleweed fences around the chicken coop and tested them with handfuls of thrown dirt, which was not scientific, but was earnest. Halvor proposed in February of 1901. He proposed by asking Matilda whether she wanted to consolidate the two claims' fence maintenance into a single schedule, and Matilda said yes. And then Halvor said he meant more than the fences, and Matilda said she knew what he meant, and they were married in March by a circuit preacher who performed the ceremony in Markham's kitchen because Markham's kitchen was the warmest room in the county, and Markham had offered it without being asked, which was the closest Alpheus Markham ever came to expressing sentiment about anything. Royston's end came not through confrontation, but through the quiet mechanics of a man who misunderstood the thing he was imitating. In the winter of 1900, Royston built a barrier around a leased cattle lot on the eastern edge of the county. He used tumbleweeds because tumbleweeds were free, and because the word brecca had become associated with winter survival, and Royston understood the value of association, even when he did not understand the value of the thing being associated with. He packed the weeds tight, solid, dense, no gaps, no porosity, no light visible through the wall when tested with a flame. He used 2-foot stakes because they were faster to drive. He did not bury anchors because anchoring took time, and Royston's time was worth more to Royston than cattle were. The storm came on the 12th of January, 1901. Not as severe as the 99 outbreak, 30-mile winds, 12 below, heavy snow, but sustained. The wind hit Royston's solid tumbleweed wall and did what wind does to solid walls. It pushed. It did not break into fragments. It did not spend itself in 1,000 small confusions. It hit the wall as a single organized force, and the wall, lacking anchors, lacking flexibility, lacking the porosity that would have let the force pass through in harmless pieces, took the full impact and held for 2 hours and then folded. The collapse was not gradual. The wall went over in a single motion, like a sail cut from its mast, and the packed tumbleweeds fell across the cattle lot and buried the fence line that kept the cattle contained. And 16 head of mixed breed stock walked over the fallen wall and into the storm and scattered across 3 miles of open prairie. Markham and Halver spent 2 days finding the cattle. They cut wire and pulled tumbleweed debris off the collapsed fence line. They drove the surviving cattle, 14 of the 16, 2 having frozen in a draw a mile south, back to Royston's lot. Royston was in Tribune during the roundup, settling a debt at the bank, and he did not see the work that 2 men he had mocked did on his behalf. He saw the results. He saw the collapsed wall and the missing cattle and the cost of replacing them. And he did what Royston always did. He blamed someone else. "Brecca's weed nonsense," he told Ned Pritchard at the store. "The method does not work. My wall went down in 30-mile wind." Jace Morley was in the store. Morley, whose hand still bore the white patches of healed frostbite from the night he had crawled to Halvor's south entry. Morley, whose daughter had nearly burned when Royston's engineered-away weed screen caught fire. Morley, who had spent 4 days building a proper fence with Halvor, and who understood in his blistered hands the difference between a packed pile and a porous barrier. Morley said, "You did not build Brecca's fence. You built a pile." The store went quiet. Royston looked at Morley. Morley looked back. The silence held the shape of every argument that had ever been settled not by the loudest voice, but by the most accurate one. "Your wall had no anchors," Morley continued, "no porosity, no fire breaks, 2-foot stakes in frozen ground. You built a sail and called it a fence, and the wind treated it like a sail. That is not Brecca's method. That is your method, and your method killed 2 of your own cattle." Royston left the store. He did not respond. There was nothing to respond with. The evidence was in the collapsed wall and the dead cattle and the blistered hands of a man who knew the difference because he had learned it the hard way. Royston did not leave the county. He continued leasing grass and speculating on distressed claims and doing the things that men like Royston do in every community in every era. But he stopped selling weed screens. He stopped using Halvor's name. And he said exactly once to Markham on a spring afternoon when both men were watching a thunderhead build in the west, "A man can be wrong about weeds." Markham said nothing. He did not need to. The admission, small as it was, had cost Royston more than the 2 dead cattle, and both men knew it. By 1902, the Brecca Crowell place had 3 systems running. A temporary tumbleweed catch outside the north yard, replaced each autumn with cleaner weeds stripped of seed heads. A growing willow and wild plum hedge along the north and northwest faces, now in its 2nd year of growth with roots established and branches thickening, and the original low sod bank against the cabin's north wall, which Halvor had finally built with a borrowed team in the spring of 1900. The 3 systems worked in layers. The outer tumbleweed catch, now placed 60 feet from the cabin, intercepted the first wave of blowing snow and dropped it in a controlled drift. The willow hedge, 40 feet out, caught what passed through the tumbleweed and slowed it further. The sod bank tight against the cabin stopped the remnants. Each layer reduced the wind by a fraction, and the fractions compounded until the air around the cabin was still enough for the stove to keep up in any wind short of a tornado. 12 families across 2 winters learned the method. Not all of them built the full 3-layer system. Some built only a tumbleweed catch. Some planted only willow. Some combined methods in ways Halvor had not considered. A family named Ricker planted a double row of sunflowers as a summer wind catch and left the standing stalks as a winter brush barrier, which worked well enough for mild storms and cost nothing but seed. Each adaptation was a variation on the principle, and the principle held across all of them. Disrupt the wind before it reaches the thing you are protecting. Halvor never claimed he had invented windbreaks. Men had been planting trees and stacking brush against wind for centuries. What Halvor had done was find a material that was free, abundant, and despised, and he had applied a principle he had learned from a sick railroad man who had learned it from 14 years of building snow fences for the Union Pacific. The chain of knowledge ran from the railroad to the prairie to 12 families' claims, and each link in the chain had been forged by labor and tested by weather and paid for in blood and blisters and frozen hands. Marit became the keeper of the record. She kept a ledger in a school notebook, recording which families had built fences, what design they used, how the fences performed in each storm, and what modifications worked or failed. She drew wind diagrams on slate during the school term, showing the younger children how porous barriers created lee zones, and the teacher, Scow, a woman from Ohio who had never seen a tumbleweed throw out, let her use 15 minutes of class time each Friday because the diagrams were clearer than anything in the textbooks, and the knowledge was more immediately useful than long division. Tollef grew stronger. The wet cough that had rattled in his chest since infancy diminished as the cabin's air quality improved. Less wind-driven dust, less smoke from a stove that now drew properly, less cold air leaking through sealed gaps. By 1903, he was running in the yard without stopping to gasp, and by 1905 he was helping Halvor maintain the willow hedge, cutting dead wood and weaving new growth into the gaps the way his father wove tumbleweeds into stake rows. Halvor and Matilda had a daughter in 1903 and a son in 1905. The cabin expanded. Halvor added a room to the south side with lumber he bought from a mill in Tribune, the first lumber he had ever purchased for the claim, paid for with money earned from selling surplus sorghum. The sod roof gave way to shingles. The cracked stove was replaced with a proper cook stove that Matilda selected and Halvor installed, and both of them argued about the placement of until they compromised on a position that satisfied neither and worked perfectly. The years compressed the way years do when labor fills them. 1906, 1910, 1915. The willow hedge grew to 12 feet and thickened into a wall of living wood that caught snow better than any tumbleweed fence ever had. The wild plum filled in beneath the willow and produced fruit in good years that Matilda preserved in jars. The tumbleweed catch became unnecessary as the living fence matured, and Halvor dismantled the outer stake rows one autumn and burned the last of the packed weeds in a pit and did not replace them. But he kept one section, 20 feet of the original north wall stake row, the posts weathered to silver gray, the wire rusted to a brown that matched the grass. Marit's tally marks were still visible on the corner post, scratched deep enough to survive 15 years of weather, 547 marks in groups of 5, the record of a 9-year-old girl counting the dead weeds that saved her family. He kept it because the living fence was Matilda's contribution, and the sod bank was Markham's advice, and the dead man anchors were Orrin's engineering, but the tally marks were Marit's, and the tumbleweeds were his, and the combination of the two was the thing that had made everything else possible. A father and a daughter counting weeds in the cold, while the world said they were building garbage. The marks on the post did not argue with the world. They simply recorded what had happened and let the winter answer. Halvor Breke died on the 9th of October, 1927, on a mild autumn afternoon. He was 61 years old. His heart stopped while he was sitting in a chair outside the south entry of a cabin that now had 4 rooms, a shingled roof, glass windows, and a living windbreak that arched above the north face like a green wall in summer and a white wall in winter. Matilda found him with his hands on his knees and his face turned north, toward the willow hedge and the old stake row beyond it, and the first loose tumbleweeds of the season were scraping across the outer posts the way they had scraped across every autumn since the day he had arrived with a lame mare and $11 and a flour tin full of paper that said this land was his. The watch was in his pocket, The time was still wrong. It had been wrong for 28 years. Within 5 winters of the Blue Norther, 12 neighboring claims had adopted some version of Halvor's principle. Some built temporary tumbleweed catches. Some planted willow or wild plum hedges. Some left standing sorghum and sunflower stalks as winter brush barriers. The exact tumbleweed fortress, 547 weeds packed in 320 feet of staked, wired, anchored rows, did not become standard because it was labor-heavy, fire-prone, and seed-laden. But the lesson spread through the county and into the next county, and into the long memory of families who passed it to their children the way Halvor's father had passed spruce branches to a boy in Norway. By doing, do not fight the wind at the cabin wall. Spend its force before it arrives. Halvor lived out his years on the same Greeley County quarter section he had nearly lost for $28. The filing improvements he owed the government were long since proven. The deed was clear. The land was paid for in a currency that did not appear on any ledger, in thorn-scratched forearms and frozen wire, and a 9-year-old girl's tally marks, and a railroad man's cough, and a neighbor woman's willow cuttings, and the particular silence that fills an enclosure when the wind outside is screaming and the air inside is still. In later winters, he kept the old section of stake row standing beside the newer hedge, not because it was needed, but because Marit's marks were on the post, and the marks were the oldest record of the oldest lesson he had learned. Count what you have, use what is thrown at you, and measure the wind until it stops being a monster and becomes a problem that your hands can solve. The Blue Norther of February. 1899 flattened grass from Montana to Texas and drove snow horizontal at 70 miles an hour across a prairie that offered nothing to stop it. In Greeley County, Kansas, 22 miles from Tribune, a sod-roofed cabin sat inside a ring of dead Russian thistle, and the lantern inside that cabin held a steady flame while the north wind roared against a wall it could not organize itself to break. Del Royston had called it a garbage fence. He had said it kept out nothing but good sense. But on the morning after the storm, Jace Morley's mitten prints were frozen into the snow at the south entry, where a dying man had crawled toward the only quiet place on the open plain, and Alpheus Markham's cane hole marked the spot where a 61-year-old stockman had pushed his stick into 10 feet of packed drift and pulled it out and said nothing because the drift had said everything, and Marit Brecka opened the cabin door without snow, falling into the room, and stepped into a yard where the air was still and the stove smoke rose straight, and 547 tally marks on a weathered post stood as the only record of what her father had built from the dead things the prairie threw at him. The wind had carried its weeds across 1,000 miles of empty grass, and Halvor Brecka had caught them and packed them and lashed them with wire and taught the wind to bury itself.